And hello, friends, and welcome to another episode of Chapters here on Armstrong Cable. Chapters is the television show that profiles local authors, editors, and publishers in our community. I'm Eliot Parker, and it's great to have you with us. Our guest on this episode of Chapters is author Jeanette Rowsey. We're going to be talking to her today about her book, The Lost Village of Barboursville, Unsung and Vanishing History of the Best Little Village in West Virginia from the years 1813 to 2013. And Jeanette Rowsey is a writer. She's a nationally accredited strategic communications consultant from Huntington, West Virginia. She graduated from Marsh University and has worked in public relations practice for over 30 years. She's also a seventh-generation descendant of the early Barboursville settlers, and The Lost Village of Barboursville is her first book, and we're delighted to have her today with us. Jeanette, nice to see you, and thanks for being on Chapters.
Thank you so much for having me.
My pleasure. Tell us a little bit first about your family history. You're the seventh-generation descendant of early Barboursville settlers. How far does your family go back in terms of being an actual sort of founding group or founding family of the village of Barboursville?
Well, I didn't have any clue really about how far back my family went until I started researching the book. But the Moore and Brady families go back to, I'd say, the previous to 1820 was when the Moore family arrived. And if anyone's familiar, probably maybe golfers in the region might be familiar with the Esquire golf course out behind Barboursville. And I discovered that those ancestors, the Moore family, that was where they had their farm, where Esquire is now. And it was because it was at a bend in the Guyan River, kind of an oddly shaped kind of piece of land within this curve. It was known as the Frying Pan Farm, so it's actually right there on the cover. But so I found out about them. I found out that they were unfortunately slave owners, and then it kind of goes on from there, and was a pretty adventurous story, I thought, about my own family. But it was just one family in a much bigger picture I was interested in.
So was it the connection to your family or your family having such deep roots going back a long time with Barboursville that got you interested in writing this book? Where did you get the idea and sort of the impetus to write this book?
I was never a history major. I was never particularly interested in history growing up. It was probably when my sons were in elementary school and I became a Cub Scout den leader that I began to be interested in the local history. There was a gentleman, I believe he was a resident of the State Veterans Home, that worked with some other local folks and made a historic walking tour of Barboursville back in the 1990s. So I used to use that guide and take my Cub Scout groups and, friends and family. We would go kind of discover the landmarks around Barboursville that we were really not familiar with as much before then. So that was kind of where it all started. And then about 20 years later, when my children grew up and moved out, I was taking a church group on a tour and using that same guide and using some genealogical information that my aunt had found. And several things had been torn down, so the guide was kind of out of date. And then there were some other things that I just kind of got kind of angry after taking this tour, just personally. And I was like, well, I would show you this, but it's not here anymore. And this building is here, but I'm not really sure what this is about. And, I just realized there was probably a lot that people didn't know. And I called my youngest son, who was away at college, and I was just complaining to him about this. And I was like, they're just going to tear everything down. And, they're just things that people don't know. And he just said, he goes, Mom, you should write a book. And it was just such an odd thing, because up to then I had never really planned to write a book. But as soon as he said that, it was just kind of like a flash of lightning. And it was like, I have to write a book. And so 4 years later, I had a book.
So yeah. How long did it take you to write the initial draft? From the time you said, I want to write this book, to the time you had at least the first draft done? What was the time frame there?
This was in October of 2009 that I kind of, I did this tour. I talked to my son. I got this inspiration to do it. It wasn't until the beginning of 2011. So it was over a year I had been doing the research, and I actually kind of just put the first outline together at the beginning of 2011. And at that point, I mean, I had been writing little bits and pieces of it, so my writing process wasn't like real linear, but I didn't know until I had done about a year's worth of research exactly what I was looking at. So that outline started, and I would say that it took probably about, well, I can't really say I had a first draft. It just kind of was a thing that just kept growing. I was drafting and editing and researching as I went. But I finished the book in July of 2013. So.
And what was your research process like? Where did you go to start to find information, or what sources or what documents were most helpful to you in putting the book together?
Well, I started out at the Barboursville Library, the public library. They had a somewhat small local history section, but that was really where I began. And I signed up. I talked to the head librarian, who I had known from high school, and said, I would like to volunteer to scan and digitize all of your historic material, because they had some boxes of clips and photos, and there was a gentleman named Frank Ball who had been a newspaper columnist, and he had done some columns back when I was a child that my grandmother would keep and we'd look at, and there was a little bit of family history in those, but he had donated scrapbooks, I found out, to the library, and so I went for every Monday for about a year, maybe a little more than a year. I would come and take my scanner and my laptop, and I would spend about 3 hours, a week going in and going through things and scanning them, and then I made the library a set of CDs and indexed them, and that was kind of my process of saying, okay, here's what is in Barboursville about Barboursville, and then through that I discovered some other really important sources, and one of those was the Special Collections Department at Marshall. They had a gentleman named, he was my hero. His name is Fred Lambert, the late Fred Lambert, and his family had donated manuscripts and photographs and all of his research about Cabell County, and it was about 500 notebooks worth of just kind of random bits of history about Cabell County. And I spent a good number of hours just kind of going through those things. I found a lot of my family stories in there that I didn't expect. Photographs, some of which are in the book. And so those were probably my biggest, kind of starting out places to say, okay, this is kind of what we're looking at. And then I did some other things. I was particularly interested in the African American history of Barboursville. My mother had grown up on Depot Street next door to the Colored Baptist Church. And it was just an old, very old kind of ramshackle building when I was a girl. I don't think they were having worship services there. But I knew from the existence of that building that there had to be some African American history and I knew from family stories that there had been some families. So one of the things I did early on, that was probably one of the most kind of obsessive things I did, is that I began a spreadsheet, and I started with all of the census information. Started with 1930 and then kind of went back from there, and then by the time before the book was over, the 1940 census became available. So I started from the early 1800s and began a spreadsheet of every slave owner, whatever they called them that decade, whether it was black, mulatto, colored, the whole, and I was really trying to look at connections of who was here, during that decade, and kind of, I built this spreadsheet of every person who was enumerated, or every number of slaves that were enumerated in the slave schedules. And when I printed this thing out, it took up most of a wall, but it was kind of like my process of trying to connect the dots of, were there slaves that remained, how do we discover, and that was a challenge, but it was also real fascinating to me. Mm-hmm. So I did a lot of work with census material and deed records, and there's a whole wealth of things that I think people in this region are very lucky to have to research if you have the time. And I just kind of considered it I was also starting my own private public relations practice at the same time, and I had some clients I was working with, so I was kind of using like a day a week I would go and kind of explore, and I found that really fun. It was just kind of like going on vacation in your own community and looking for things, kind of detective work.
Great.
So,
very interesting.
yeah.
You mentioned a gentleman's name in the prologue, Frank Ball.
Yes.
How was he helpful to you in research as well?
Well, he had passed away. So, again, he was a great source. He had done columns for the Herald Advertiser, for the Barboursville paper when it existed. So he had done this series called Avenue of Antiquity back when I was a girl, and he had gone down Main Street and had interviewed families and descendants of some of the, centennial homes in the area, and really was helpful just to kind of get the lay of the land from his work. But he had passed away in the 1980s, so there was just a lot that, still a lot of questions that I had. But his work was great. There was a gentleman, an advertiser, columnist who'd done a history series back in the 70s and 80s. There was a lady named Frances Gunter who had done about a 30 to 50 page Barboursville history book with her middle school students. So there were some little footholds, but I just was really determined to kind of get the whole picture. And Barboursville was a good place to do that because it was a small enough town, especially when you look at the African American family history, that you could sort of wrap your hands around a small enough number of people that you can handle it. That it was still a lot, but it was, if I tried to do Huntington, for example, or a larger city, it would have been overwhelming. And Barboursville just turned out to be a great, just kind of a good microcosm of America, and looking at how that story progressed through our village.
One of the things that's so interesting about your book is, and I guess this is true of any community or any town that you research, is that Barboursville kind of goes through this cycle of kind of boom and bust.
Sure.
As time goes on, you start us in 1813, you take us all the way up through 2013, and we see that cyclical, good times and bad times over and over again. When you did your research and you were putting the book together, were there any themes that you saw that created those boom and busts? For example, was it decisions by politicians at the time that led to that? Was it economic factors that led to that? Were there any common threads that, as Barboursville kind of had to continue to reinvent itself over its 200 years, that stood out to you and you thought, well, that was just like it was 50 years ago?
Well, there were several things. I think one was just the transportation lines of the era. Barboursville was at the confluence of two rivers, and it was far enough away from the Ohio that, it was always kind of a pocket community, rather than a major place that you just happened to cross all the time. So the rivers, I think, kind of, it was a place worth finding. And then the turnpike, it was the James River and Kanawha Turnpike, which is not only what comprises Main Street in Barboursville, but is also East Peerage, West Peerage Road, where I'm from, and then parts of Huntington. That road was the third busiest national highway of its time.
Wow.
So that really put Barboursville, I think, on the map of having, that traffic going through there. And then the railroad was sort of the beginning and the end. The railroad came through Barboursville, but then Collis P. Huntington, as we know, took that railroad to Huntington, built a bigger city, kind of overshadowed Barboursville for, about 100 years. And, so I think the transportation, just the impact, of where you put your highways and your main thoroughfares was sort of Barboursville's making and its undoing. And then again, it kind of came back, and when the interstate came through and they decided to put them all on the interstate, it kind of all sort of came back towards Barboursville again for the region. Yeah. So I would say that would be a really recurring theme, would be the effect of where people put their transportation hubs. And I think beyond that, I think Barboursville seemed to have a number of, I think, visionary, business-oriented people that were kind of ready for the opportunities as they came along. So I think if you look at today versus, in the 1820s, I think you can see some similarities there. There were people that, they weren't your typical Appalachian mountain folk that are isolated. They were, again, sort of like we're Kentucky, Ohio, and West Virginia. We're sort of a semi-metropolitan region here, and Barboursville was really, right in there in that type of attitude about, yes, we are connected with the outside world. The stagecoach is coming through, and we're reading the papers and following the news and taking advantage of the industrial opportunities as they come along. And, I think we've had that, and we've had an educated base of citizens that have been able to kind of take the ups and downs and make the best of them over 200 years. So
you mentioned too about slavery and that being an African American community being an important part of your book. And in chapter 12, one of the things that I found was really interesting is post-Civil War, you started to see more African Americans coming this way,
right,
and migrating here. And you talk about in 1880 how Huntington had 10 times as many people as Barboursville. By 1900, Huntington's population had grown 30 times that of Barboursville. And some of that was Marshall University, obviously, the need for dorms and classrooms and buildings downtown. And now it's interesting how you look at today, and you look at the two communities and the two cities, and where Huntington has significantly lost population, Barboursville has kind of become not really a suburb of Huntington, but a lot of people work in the city or work downtown or on the outskirts of the city, but live in Barboursville. So it's interesting how 113 years or so that the pattern changes a little bit in terms of migrating, where people are coming from, then ultimately where they move to.
Sure. Yeah, it was kind of like we were, there was that westward expansion, and then it comes back east a little bit more, and it's kind of that. It's almost like the old frontier story that people want cheaper land, lower taxes. They want to find a place that's out of a little bit more out of the way, where they can spread out a little more, and the area surrounding Barboursville is still, people have found that to be a good place to develop. Obviously, I mean, I went from my family lived in Huntington. We've moved back to the Barboursville area when my children were born, and there's a lot to be said for having the mall and restaurants and, all of, we have a lot of great conveniences nearby. But I think it's like politically, there's always going to be people who want to get away from city taxes and city, hassles and that kind of thing. And, Barboursville is kind of what went around came around, with Barboursville.
Well, one thing you mentioned too that I found was really interesting was the brick making, and you've got a section in your book. We were talking before we went on the air, and I couldn't remember the other thing that I remember about Barboursville, and that was the brick making.
Okay.
I couldn't find it, so I wanted to ask you about that. You have a section of B stands for, and you talk about brick making and the role that George Thornburg played, who died in 1927, but how he sort of built that modern brick factory there on Peyton Street in Barboursville. And it may have been called the Barboursville Brick Company or the Guyan Valley Brick Company, but really his effort to kind of spearhead building that first brick factory led to a lot of other industrialization moving into the area. Can you talk a little bit about that period in Barboursville's history?
Oh gosh, well, the Thornburgs, they were one of the several families that were sort of enduring and influential in the village. And George Thornburg, he was not only he started the brick plant on Peyton Street. He was, I believe, one of the first banks. He was the trustee of that. He was influential in the Methodist Church, which kind of brought about Morris Harvey College, which used to be, of course, eventually became University of Charleston. He helped found the college. He was involved with the bringing in the telephone line. So it was kind of like you could have like one guy, and it was sort of a predecessor to Thornburg was William Clinton and Miller back in the early 1800s, that you could have like one guy who it's like does so many things that are influential, and I think he was definitely a big fish in a small pond kind of person. But right around that time, that was when they started bringing in the electric lines. They started making an effort at paving the roads, but I tell you, one of the things that was really right at that same time that probably would not have been possible to have seen that kind of industrial development was without the railroad. And even though Huntington was kind of really overshadowing Barboursville, one of the things that was a surprise to me was I believe it was in 1904, was that the completion of the Guyan Valley Railroad down to Logan and the opening up of the Logan coal field. So when that happened, the mine production exponentially grew in 1 year and brought a lot of jobs, brought a lot of immigration, to the whole region. And that started in Barboursville. And I was not aware. It was like I always saw that track going by my grandmother's house and saw coal, chunks of coal falling off, but just never realized the historical significance of that railroad there too. So that was a big, just a big booming time for industry. And, folks like Thornburg were just there to kind of, say, okay, how can we make this city better,
Yeah, absolutely. I want to ask you too about, you've got so much good information in here, and you talked about your research process. Is there anything that stood out to you in terms of something that, as you were doing your research, or as you were putting this book together, you thought, I did not know that, and that's been the best thing I've discovered about Barboursville, or the best little research nugget that stood out to me? Did you have one or a couple things that really stood out to you?
It just kept happening. It just kept happening because there would be so many things when I was in Marshall going through the Lambert papers. And this was just kind of, it's a nerdy thing, I'm sure, but, I discovered there, John Laidley, who helped form Marshall University, and there was a gentleman named George Buring, a German immigrant. There was Solomon Thornburg, who is the ancestor of the fellow we just talked about, and another fellow named John, Samuels. So there were these four guys, and they came in right about the time Barboursville was established from different parts around the country. And they were all involved with the formation of Marshall Academy. And they were all born in 1791. And that just kind of blew my mind when I discovered that, because it was sort of like nobody else, it's like, I don't know that anyone else cares, but no one else in the world knows that these guys were 21 years old when they came to Barboursville. Two of them were attorneys. And again, they were sort of like the Thornburgs. They were just individual men who had a great deal of influence, not only at their time, but, they set the magisterial districts. They, the plot of the way the streets are still set in Barboursville. Things that still continue today to be the way our county looks. It's amazing to me. And they were so young, and they just decided to put themselves in this new town, and they were all born the same year. So there were things like that where I would find people that were born around the same time, and they would be very influential people. And so you just kind of think about eras or conditions when people were coming into the world. And that was also the time I found out it was like the War of 1812 was going on. They were active in the War of 1812. It was a very patriotic time. Mm-hmm. And again, it was just that kind of gung-ho, let's build America, kind of spirit. And I look back at, and with my children and their peers and a lot of the younger people can you imagine somebody at 21 years old today having that much drive and influence, to do something like that? It was just, that was one of the first discoveries. And then there were just, there were just so many, and one of the things that was just a delight to me, and as I met people and talked to people, they would have photos and they would give me more material. And when I was doing the research on the African American families, there were so many of them that I came across the photographs of these families, and some of them were, pre-turn of the century. And just to be able to find pictures of these people that you're studying, or go to the cemetery and see somebody's name, it's like you feel like you've come to know them. And that was just, the research process and the discovery process throughout, to me, it was just fun, and finding those discoveries is something I hope when people have read the book have found to be, a fun, enjoyable thing to learn as well.
So I want to ask you also about future projects. What are you working on now? What's the next project that you're working on? And are you looking at doing another historical collection of another community, just like you did Barboursville?
I have no plans to do another community. It was a lot it was a lot of work. It took about twice as long to write as I ever imagined it would. But again, it was because I kept discovering things. What I'm actually interested in doing, I built a web page, I built a Facebook page, so we have a lot of interaction with people who are interested, and kind of built this community of people who are interested in Barboursville history, which is sort of my goal from the outset. Was, I want people to care about the history. And one of the things that I did last fall was I made a YouTube trailer, a little advertisement for the book. And once I did that, and again, we know that there's a lot you can do with laptops that you used to have a whole room full of equipment to do in the past. And one of the things I would like to do this year is to make some kind of video documentary clips of some of the stories or some of the chapters in this history. Because as we know, people aren't all readers. And I think especially younger folks, I'd like to make that history even more accessible to people. And so I don't really have any plans of leaving Barboursville and exploring another area, unless it were to be like the Pea Ridge area, or things that are just kind of tied into there. There's places that I might go deeper with it. But I'm enjoying marketing the book and giving tours and talking about the history, and I don't foresee a time when I will take on another writing project, but I never intended to take this one on either, so.
Can never, one of those never say never.
Yeah, you can never say never, but no immediate plans.
So Jeanette, if someone in our audience wants to contact you, wants to find out more information about the book, or wants to get a copy of The Lost Village of Barboursville, how can they do that? How can they get in contact with you?
Well, the best way, I have a website. Again, the website was done before the book was done, and it's www.lostvillageofbarboursville.com. So that's pretty easy. I have a Facebook page by the same name. If you find the website, or you just go to Facebook and type in Lost Village of Barboursville.
Okay.
I've got a good number of followers. I've been really, really pleased with that. And then it's also on Amazon.
Okay.
So and it's also here at Empire Books and
Fantastic.
a few other retailers as well.
Great, great. Well, Jeanette Rowsey, author of the book, The Lost Village of Barboursville, Unsung and Vanishing History of the Best Little Village in West Virginia from 1813 to 2013. We enjoyed having you on Chapters today. A fascinating conversation, and I certainly hope anybody that wants to learn more about the little village that's right next to Huntington will check out your book, because I learned a whole lot, and I know our audience will too. Very well done. Really enjoyed it. Thank you so much for being here. We appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
And finally, so many of our episodes of Chapters are put together by a lot of people who do work in front of the camera and behind the camera. And some of those people that help us behind the camera are the staff and management at Empire Books and News here at Pullman Square in Huntington. They provide our studio taping space, and we appreciate that so much. We encourage you to come down and check out Jeanette Rowsey's book on the Lost Village of Barboursville. It's available for sale here at Empire Books and News, as is many of the other books written by the authors and publishers we featured here on Chapters. Their books are for sale here at Empire Books and News. So we encourage you to stop by, talk to Charlotte and her staff, and let them find you the book that you're looking for to satisfy your reading taste, and that is right here at Empire Books and News. And if you have a question, comment, or suggestion about this Chapters program or any Chapters program that we've aired here on Armstrong Cable, we want to hear from you. You can send us an email to the address at the bottom of the screen right here. That is LP4, letter L, letter P, number 4, at zoominternet.net. Please keep those comments coming. We appreciate them so much. And if you want to go back and watch a previous episode of Chapters from our 2+ seasons of author and publisher interviews, you can do that by visiting the Armstrong One Wire YouTube page. The address is right here at the bottom of the screen as well, www.youtube.com/Armstrong One Wire. Look for the Chapters tab, and you can go back and see this program and any program that we have aired on Chapters. We have over 10 hours of author and publisher interviews, so we encourage you to check that out. If there's a program you want to watch again or maybe missed along the way, they can be found there at the Armstrong One Wire YouTube page. So please stop by and check that out as well. And that's going to do it for us this time on Chapters. Please come again next time. And in the meantime, stay tuned to this station for news and views that impact you and your community.